Salve discipuli. Today we're going to be talking about politics and elections in ancient Rome. From the very beginning of Roman history, they were obsessed with politics, and we're going to talk specifically about politics during the Roman Republic. The Romans referred to their politics as sort of the Cursus Honorum. This is the path of honors. It's a system of political offices in ancient Rome, things that people would get elected to. All offices that ancient Romans had, except for the Censor and the Dictator, which we'll talk about later, served their term for just 1 year, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 6, just 1. I ask you guys why the Romans would think this way. And I'll give you a hint. I always think the answer has to do with the fact that they had kings before they started electing people. So take a minute and think about that. You can pause the video here. All right. For Romans, for rich Roman men, people who were patricians, the old families in Rome, this was the only acceptable career. If you were in farming, that's fine, but you were supposed to be into politics too. You couldn't get into business, you couldn't get into art, you couldn't get into literature. This was the respectable path. Everything else was lesser than this. And if you didn't even have some political experience and you were from one of these old families that sent a lot of people into politics, it was weird. Romans were in power for a very long period of time. So there's a lot of slight changes here and there, but the path stays the same. One quick note on patricians and plebeians. These are terms that we're going to be using throughout the video. These are groups of people, and it's a roughly sort of corresponding to the rich upper classes and the poor lower classes. They were assigned in the earliest days of the Roman kingdom using wealth. Wealthy families were patricians, poor families were plebeians. As time goes on, this distinction becomes less important, and the way that that wealth is distributed becomes more erratic too. You see rich plebeians by the end of the Republic, and you even see some poor or impoverished patricians as well. Our first office is called quaestor. 20 people were elected to be quaestor each year. They're financial administrators. They're accountants in Rome and the provinces. They handle money and they distribute money. Nowadays, things are different, where you have to realize that people can send money just by check or over the internet. But back then, you had to physically move gold around. So having lots of officials whose job it was to count, distribute, travel with this gold was rather important. After spending a year as a quaestor, you got to be in the Senate for the rest of your life. Now, why do you think the Romans wanted their senators to serve for the rest of their lives? Why not have them get reelected every couple of years? Take a minute, think about this. Pause the video here if you need to and answer that question. All right. So quaestors had to be 30 years old. That was an age requirement for it. Generally, the more powerful your family was, the more you were expected to run for quaestor when you turned 30. And remember, the big qualification is that you have to have lots of money. You do have to win an election as well, but that money qualification is the thing that can stop you from even running. Our next office is called Aedile. It's an optional office. It's kind of weird. You don't have to do this one. In the city of Rome, 4 were elected each year, usually 2 patricians and 2 plebeians. Out in the provinces, out in other cities, they also had aediles that would run things for the city. Their job tends to be maintenance. They're supposed to hire people to fix things, roads, public works, buildings, things like that. You have to be about 36 years old to be an aedile, which means that you'd be in the Senate for a couple of years beforehand. A lot of times, these people use their own wealth or their family's money to finance festivals or repairs or something like that. And if they did that, usually they would put their own name on it. So, Aemilius built this aqueduct. Appius built this road in big bronze letters in the pavement. And I ask you here, if it costs so much and you don't have to do it, like if you can skip this office, you can go quaestor all the way to praetor without being an aedile, why bother with it? Take a minute, write down your answer. Pause the video here if you need to. All right. Our next office is the praetor. 6 to 8 of these guys get elected each year. Almost all of them are patricians throughout all Rome's history. You have to be 39 years old, so a couple of years between being an aedile and being a praetor, even if you get it as young as you possibly can. Their main function day to day was to serve as a legal case judge. So basically, if someone took you to court, a praetor would be judging. That meant that they had this concept called imperium or command, which a lot of times the Romans would use as authority over life and death. If you were a judge in ancient Rome, you had to be able to sentence people to punishment, and the Romans didn't really imprison people for long periods of time. A lot of people were beaten, caned, fined, or executed in ancient Rome. Those were the main punishments. In times of war, they start serving as generals or colonels, some high ranking officer under the consuls, we'll talk about next. And after their 1 year term, they usually go out and govern one of the provinces as a pro-praetor. This is basically someone who was a praetor before. They get to wear the toga praetexta, which has a big stripe on it. Everybody else's togas were just white. And when they're in office, they get escorted by these people called lictors, who you can see at the right there. These are bodyguards provided by the state. They carry the symbol of office, which is called the fasces, which is a bunch of rods with an axe wrapped around it. You can think about what those both stand for because, well, a lot of people think the lictors were actually trained to fight using those. Next up, consuls. Every year, 2 consuls were elected. For most of Roman history, they were patricians. Every once in a while, you hear about someone who was born a plebeian, usually during periods of social unrest, becoming elected to consul. You have to be minimum 42 years old, and these are the most powerful people in the state. That's what a magistrate is. It's someone who does something for it. That's actually connected to the word magister for teacher. They have veto power over each other, which means that if either of them starts doing something that the other one doesn't like, they can forbid the other from doing it. And if the Senate passes any laws, both of them have to be okay with executing it, or else it doesn't happen. In times of war, they serve as supreme commanders of the army. Early on in Roman history, they would actually take turns. So one day Consul A is in charge, and one day Consul B is in charge, and go back and forth. Later on, they realized how ridiculous that was, and you start seeing them split up, usually the army, into 2 big wings, or one is on defense and one is on offense. After a 1 year term, you sent to govern a more important province as a proconsul. You got to wear the toga praetexta, and you were escorted by more lictors than the praetors, so you had more of these bodyguards. When you get to be these consular governors, like the consuls had or the praetors had, this is actually an opportunity for Romans to become very rich, and they'd get a chance to sort of earn back some of the money that they would spend campaigning and running for office. When you were in charge of a province, you got a very, very generous salary paid for out of the taxes of people in those provinces, and you got to set the tax rate, so you had a lot of control over your own salary. If you were in charge of a province that was at war, or if you had to go to war with an enemy, if you were on Rome's borders, you could actually take spoils from the enemy and take a decent share of them as the general. That was accepted practice in ancient Rome. So consuls tended to be rather rich. Every year you would elect consuls and all the offices that we've talked about before. The next couple of offices are special and different. They don't follow exactly the same rules. So let's talk about censors, or censors as the Romans would say. You had to be a proconsul in order to become a censor. Every 5 years, they would elect 2 censors, and they'd serve for a year and a half, 18 months. They perform a census, which is a count of the population of Rome. And they also made sure that people who were running for office had enough money to qualify for it. There was also a responsibility that they had to make sure, pardon me, to make sure that people's morals were in the right way. If somebody was involved in a scandal in politics, they could be kicked out of the Senate, and it was the censors' jobs to do that. It was an extremely important position to become a censor, and it was very high honor for you and your family. In fact, a very famous Roman politician, Cato the Censor, sometimes called Cato the Elder, well, considering we know him as Cato the Censor, this is literally how people refer to him. It tells you how important that is. Okay. Next up is Dictator. This is a very famous one, but it's often a little bit misunderstood. Again, you have to be proconsul for this to happen. And you get elected during an emergency. The Senate says, we need a dictator. And for 6 months, you serve. Dictators have absolute power over the Roman government. They can do whatever they want. They can force laws into existence, say there is now a new law for this. They can say this law doesn't exist anymore, or it doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't apply to this group of people. The only thing they're not allowed to do is extend the length of their term. The most famous Roman dictator is this guy, Cincinnatus, or Cincinnatus, who became dictator, won a war, and resigned within about 3 weeks. He's famous because he gave up this absolute power. Now, a lot of students ask me, what happens if somebody really is really cruel? What if they have all their enemies put to death? What if they abuse their power? What if they take a huge amount of money for themselves? Well, eventually their term as dictator ends. And the next question I ask you guys is, what do you think happens to a dictator who abuses their power once they're not dictator anymore? Take a minute, write down your answer. Our last special office is called Tribune of the Plebs. A lot of times people just refer to these people as tribunes. You have to be a plebeian or plebeian to get this. And what happens is when you were elected to this position, you would go through a ritual at some of the temples in Rome. And all night you'd stay up, people would pray over you, you'd make sacrifices. And when it was over, your body was sacrosanct. This is a really cool word. That means that the gods were protecting their physical body. You were not allowed to touch a tribune of the plebs without their permission. Presumably one of the gods would just strike you down on the spot if you did that. Or more likely, all of the plebs that they were associated with would openly rebel and fight back. They had veto power, the ability to forbid something or stop something, over everyone else in the Roman government. Eventually, they say, well, we'll just stop everything unless you take a look at this bill. They can't make you vote for it, but they can stop everything else until people actually start talking about it. Their whole job was to defend and protect plebeians, poorer, more oppressed Romans, from oppression by the patricians. That was their entire job. I want you guys to think about what kind of stuff would lead to the plebeians having an office like this. And I want you to think of what it would actually look like if you're not allowed to touch their body without their permission, how they would actually exercise their veto power, what this would look like. Because frankly, what you're thinking of is probably what's going on. That's the last question for the homework assignment that you guys have there for the questions. So take some time, write this down, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.